They call me Delia Rourke. I've always been the one people came to when things fell apart. The calm voice on the phone, the casserole on the porch, the no worries, I've got it kind of daughter. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to be on the receiving end of care. And then, one winter evening, something shifted. Not loudly, just enough to wake me up. Stay with me until the end of this story, and when it's over, tell me. Did I do the right thing? Would you have done the same? I could really use your honesty. Christmas, the year I turned 42, began with 6 hours on the road, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and a locked front door. I had driven all the way from Bozeman, across icy highways, and under a sky the color of cold steel, only to stand outside the house I grew up in, my mother's house, while snow collected quietly on my coat sleeves. Inside, lights were on. Music was playing. But no one opened the door. I remember staring at the wreath, plastic holly, and a lopsided red bow, thinking, this is some kind of mistake. But even then, a part of me knew better. I'm Delia Rourke, insurance claims manager for Greenledge, going on 18 years now. Not married, no kids. I've had exactly one serious relationship, and it ended the week I flew back to take care of Mom when Dad landed in the ICU. I didn't ask him to wait. He didn't offer. We just fizzled, like warm soda left out on the counter. That's the kind of woman I've been. Available to everyone but myself. I'm the oldest of three. Kurt's 2 years younger, Marla's 4. If something breaks, they call me. If someone forgets rent, I cover it. If Mom cries, I'm the one who listens. That was always the trade. I keep the peace, and in return, I get to feel like I matter. For most of my adult life, I was the one who arrived early for the holidays, stocked the fridge, set the table, made cinnamon rolls from scratch. I wrapped gifts for everyone, even the ones I didn't buy. Last year, I spent a whole afternoon untangling the same string of lights that Kurt had just shoved into a box. No one noticed, of course. That was the deal. You only notice what's missing when it stops showing up. This year, I hadn't brought the cookies. I hadn't sent the group text asking for grocery preferences. I hadn't even gotten a "can't wait to see you" from anyone. All I had was a text from Marla 3 days ago. This year, let's keep things chill, okay? No stress. And nothing after that. Still, I came. Because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. The drive was long and mostly silent. I didn't even bother with Christmas songs, just let the radio hum static between mountains. I watched the snow fall in thick, drifting sheets and tried not to think too hard about how quiet my phone had been. I told myself they were busy, that they assumed I'd just show up and make things work, like always. But as I pulled onto Mulberry Lane and saw the glow through the frosted windows, people were already there. I could make out shadows moving, laughter spilling out in muffled bursts. No one had mentioned starting early. I climbed the steps, boots crunching against the shoveled walkway, knocked once, twice, waited. Then I rang the bell. Nothing. I tried again, holding the button longer this time, still nothing. I stepped back and looked up. That's when I saw the curtain shift slightly on the second floor. I didn't see who it was, but I heard them. The window was cracked just enough for voices to sneak through. Marla's, unmistakable. God, it's kind of peaceful this year. No one barking about oven temps or where the centerpiece goes. Then a male voice, maybe Kurt, chuckled. And Marla again. Seriously though, try having Christmas without Mother Teresa for once. It's a vibe. Laughter. The kind that makes your gut twist because you know it wasn't meant for you to hear. I didn't move. Not at first. Just stood there like some idiot from a Hallmark movie with her arms full of nothing. The cold had worked its way through my coat, into the small spaces between my shoulder blades. It crept up the back of my neck. But I didn't go back to the car. I kept staring at that door. The wreath looked different now, more like a cheap cover for something rotten underneath. I didn't cry. I wish I had. It would have made sense, would have felt normal. But instead, all I felt was a quiet click somewhere deep in my chest, like a light going out. Not rage, not heartbreak, just a clean, simple silence, and the kind of cold that doesn't come from the weather. I didn't drive home that night. I drove to the Southway Motel, just off A90, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet, where the ice machine wheezed like it had asthma. I'd booked it a few days before, just in case, I'd told myself. Not because I expected to be locked out of my own family's Christmas, but because, well, some part of me must have known. The room was cold. Not in temperature. The heater clanked to life soon enough. But in feeling. I dropped my bag on the chair, took off my coat, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands still gloved. For a while, I just stared at the wall. I didn't cry. Maybe I should have. But all I could do was go over that moment outside the house, replaying their laughter like a skipping record. Mother Teresa, Marla had called me. I used to think that nickname was affectionate. I don't anymore. I lay awake most of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, a different memory floated up. Me smoothing things over between Mom and Marla after a fight about daycare payments. Me quietly covering Kurt's rent for the third time in 1 year. Me taking time off work when Dad fell and no one else could get away. I kept thinking, I was always the one holding the seams together. And somehow, I became the one easiest to cut out. By morning, the numbness had settled into something heavier. Not quite anger. Just a dull, pressing sadness. The kind that makes your hands feel too big, like they don't fit anywhere. I didn't feel like going back to Bozeman. Not yet. So I drove into town, to an old haunt I hadn't set foot in for years. Red Pine Books and Brew. It used to be my hiding place in college, whenever I felt like I couldn't breathe. I hadn't meant to go there, not really. My hands just turned the wheel, and next thing I knew, I was parked out front, staring at the same faded mural on the brick wall. A painted pine tree with books for branches. Inside, the air smelled like cardamom and roasted espresso. It was warm in a way the motel hadn't been. Familiar. Soft jazz played low through the speakers. I was about to order when I heard a voice behind the counter say, "Delia Rourke?" I looked up and saw her, Nina Caldwell. We'd gone to college together. Same lit classes, same sarcasm about everything. I hadn't seen her since graduation, but there she was, wiping her hands on an apron with ink stains on it and looking at me like no time had passed at all. "God," I said, half laughing. "You still exist." She smiled. "Same could be said for you. Sit. You look like you need something that isn't on the menu." She didn't ask what brought me in, just made me a cup of something she called her Reset Blend, a mix of dark roast, nutmeg, and something floral I couldn't quite place. We sat by the window, and I wrapped my hands around the mug like it was an anchor. For a few minutes, we just talked about nothing. Books, the cold, the fact that her cat apparently hates snow. Then my phone buzzed. It was a Facebook notification, a post from Marla. I opened it. A photo. The family crowded around the fireplace, Mom smiling, Kurt balancing one of Marla's kids on his knee. Caption: "Finally, a real Christmas. Just family." No mention of me. Not even a passive one. I stared at it for a moment too long. My thumb hovered over the screen like I might type something, but I didn't. Nina leaned over, glanced at the photo, then looked back at me. She didn't say, "That's cruel." She didn't say, "You deserve better." She just said softly, "You ever think maybe loving people by disappearing for them is still disappearing?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have thoughts. God, I had plenty. But because none of them could form words. I just nodded, once. Then I took a sip of her strange, warm coffee. It burned a little going down. Not unpleasantly. Like waking up after too much sleep. The text from Mom came in just after sunrise. "You're back in town? Why didn't you say something? Don't blow things out of proportion, Delia." Like I was a leaky faucet, dripping drama into an otherwise calm kitchen. 5 minutes later, Kurt chimed in. "Seriously, Delia? You think you're the only one who's ever done something for this family?" Then, the cherry on top. "Stop acting like a martyr. You're not the victim here." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to reply to people who could pretend so well that nothing happened, that I hadn't stood outside in the snow, listening to them laugh inside the house I used to call home, that I hadn't felt like the coat rack they finally decided to move out of the hallway, useful until it was in the way. Marla didn't text at all, and somehow that silence was louder than both of theirs combined. I spent most of that day sitting on my couch back in Bozeman, the blinds half closed, the living room dim. I hadn't even unpacked my overnight bag. The motel's lemon-scented hand lotion was still in my coat pocket. I pulled out a legal pad and started writing numbers. Not for anyone else. Just for me. Kurt, $300. Car repair Marla, $1,200. Emergency tuition for Abby Mom, $850. Roof patching after the hailstorm Kurt again, $500. Utility bills Marla again, $70 here, $200 there, diapers, birthday cakes, gas money. Then I opened my laptop and dug into my bank history. The real stuff. Wire transfers, Venmo requests, old emails with the subject lines like, quick favor, and hate to ask, but. It was like archaeology, digging through layers of a life I'd lived in the background of theirs. The numbers stacked up, over and over. I started printing everything, statements, receipts, email threads. I highlighted amounts, wrote dates in the margins, even added sticky notes to remind myself what each one was for. It looked absurd, seeing it all laid out on my dining table like evidence. Like I was preparing for trial, only the jury was never going to show up. But it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Clarity. I remembered one Thanksgiving years ago, when Marla showed up empty-handed and said, "You're the domestic one. If I brought something, you'd only fix it anyway." Everyone laughed, including me. I laughed because it was easier than saying, "That hurt." There was a pattern. And the worst part? I had let it happen. Over and over. I had convinced myself that being useful meant being loved. That if I just kept showing up, eventually they'd see me as more than the fixer, the filler, the background support. But they never did. Late that night, I opened an old group message by mistake, one I usually ignored. It was a chat between Marla and a few of her friends. I hadn't scrolled back that far in months, maybe years. And there it was, buried in a conversation about holiday stress. Delia's only around when she's doing something for someone. Take away the help, and honestly, there's not much left. She's just there. Just there. Not loved, not valued. Just there. I stared at that sentence for a long time. My first instinct was to scream or throw something, but all I did was exhale, long and slow, like letting go of a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for years. The anger didn't come. That was surprising. What came instead was a kind of stillness, heavy but not dark. A weight I'd carried so long, I forgot what it felt like to notice it. That message from Marla didn't make me hate her. It didn't even make me want to yell. It just confirmed something I'd tried to ignore for too long. This wasn't love. This was usefulness mistaken for connection. It wasn't family. It was function. And for the first time in my adult life, I looked at the numbers, the notes, the highlighted lines, and realized I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the imbalance. I had just been too tired, too loyal, too desperate for belonging to call it what it was. Abuse doesn't always come in screams or slaps. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in holiday bows and birthday texts, hidden in phrases like, "You're the strong one," and "You always know what to do." And I'd believed it. Until now. I put the last printout in a folder and labeled it in black ink. For when they ask. Then I slid it into my drawer. And I slept without dreaming of them. It was snowing again that afternoon, the kind of soft, slow flakes that look gentle but soak into your bones the second you stop moving. I found myself back at Red Pine Books and Brew, almost by muscle memory. I didn't even take off my coat this time, just slid into the corner booth where Nina usually sat during her breaks and waited. She showed up 5 minutes later, with a mug in each hand, and that familiar expression, half curiosity, half concern. "You look like you've made a decision," she said, sliding the mug toward me. "Or like you haven't slept in 3 days. Maybe both?" I let out a dry laugh. "Maybe both." We sat in silence for a minute, watching the snow swirl past the windows like a slow-motion film. Outside, the world was quiet. Inside me, everything was moving too fast. I broke the silence first. If I tell them the truth, if I actually show them everything I've carried for years, what they've asked of me, taken from me, my mom will be devastated. Nina leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And if you don't?" I stared down at my coffee. "Then I'm not sure I'll ever fully respect myself again." That was the truth of it. It wasn't about money anymore, or even fairness. It was about whether I could keep looking in the mirror and seeing someone who mattered, not because of what she gave, but because she existed. Nina reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. She set it between us. "Write it down," she said. "All of it. Not to mail, not to post. Just so you can see it, all in one place. A record of your side of the story. Proof that you were there, that you tried." I took the notebook home. It sat untouched on my kitchen counter for hours while I paced the apartment, reheated soup I didn't eat, turned on the TV just to mute it again. Around 10, I finally opened it. The first page I wrote was about my 36th birthday. Kurt had forgotten, but he still called that evening, needed help covering a bounced check. I sent the money. He never remembered the date, never said thank you. Another entry: the time Marla dropped her kids off at my apartment for just an hour so she could go to a doctor's appointment, and I found out later she was at a bachelorette party in the next town over. Then there was the Christmas 3 years ago when Mom told me I was being too pushy about traditions. "Let your siblings take the lead this year," she said. But when nothing got done, she scolded me for not stepping up. "You're the reliable one," she reminded me, like it was a compliment, like it wasn't a leash. I filled half the notebook in a single sitting. The writing wasn't neat. Some lines were scratched out. Some margins had angry arrows pointing at names, or amounts, or feelings I didn't want to admit. But it was mine. My record. My version of a life spent giving and waiting for someone, anyone, to say, "You've done enough." The next morning, I printed the rest. The spreadsheets, the text messages, the transfer receipts. I put everything into a plain black folder. No decoration, no pretense. On the front, in my cleanest handwriting, I wrote, "For the family, one last time." I sat with it for a while before picking up the phone. Mom answered on the second ring. "Delia, are you all right?" Her voice was warm, even worried, and for a split second, I almost folded. I almost let it go. "I'm fine," I said. "I'll be stopping by tomorrow. I'd like everyone to be there." A pause. Then, "Is something wrong?" "I just need to say a few things, that's all." Another beat of silence. Then a quiet, almost resigned, "Okay." After I hung up, I felt the fear creep in again. What if this ruined everything? What if I burned the only bridge I had left? But then I looked at the folder again, and I thought, what if the bridge was already on fire, and I was the only one pretending it wasn't? I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't feel broken. I felt ready. I stood on the porch longer than I meant to. Maybe half a minute, maybe more. My hand hovered just above the door, curled in hesitation. The cold cut through my coat like it had something to say, like it was trying to convince me to turn back. But I didn't. The knock echoed too loud in the quiet of the afternoon. Kurt opened the door, barely. He didn't greet me, just glanced at me like I was the mailman with something overdue. Then he stepped aside. No words, no nod. Just a gap in the door wide enough for me to walk through. The living room was exactly how I remembered it, which made it worse somehow. Beige everything. The same sofa with the cushion that always sagged in the middle. The wreath from last Christmas still hung above the fireplace, dust collecting in its plastic needles. It was like walking into a memory that hadn't aged well. Mom sat in her recliner, arms crossed tightly across her chest like she was bracing for a cold front, though the house was warm. Marla stood stiffly by the window, one hand lightly resting on the curtain, pretending the gray sky outside was worth focusing on. No one got up. No one smiled. No one said they were glad I came. I stayed standing, my bag still on my shoulder. I took the black folder out carefully, the way you might carry a photo of someone who broke your heart. I walked to the coffee table, leaned forward, and placed it down like I was setting a final piece on a game board. This was my move. Mom spoke first, her voice sharp with that old mix of irritation and guilt she never quite named. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I said I would," I answered, steady but quiet. Her eyes dropped to the folder. "Delia, come on. Do we really need to make this some kind of dramatic performance?" Kurt let out a laugh that had no humor. "So what? You made an invoice? Going to itemize every dime you ever spent on us?" I looked at him. "Number, I'm going to tell the truth." That shut him up. I opened the folder. The first page rustled slightly as I pulled it free. "November 12th, 2012, I began. Marla called in tears. Abby's tuition was overdue. I wired $1,200 that afternoon. Marla's shoulders tensed. She still didn't turn around. "June 8th, 2015, I continued. The roof was leaking. Mom couldn't afford the deductible. I paid $850. Kurt dropped off the receipt, never said thank you." "Delia," Mom interrupted, "is this really necessary?" I raised a hand. Not in anger, just to keep going. March 3rd, 2019. Kurt texted at 3:17 a.m. "I'm screwed. Can you cover rent this month? You're always there, right?" I transferred $700 before work, missed a meeting, got written up. Kurt shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "That was a long time ago." "I know," I said without flinching. "I kept records." I kept going. Not just the money, though there was plenty of that. I read off missed birthdays, years I hosted Christmas so no one else had to clean. I listed how many hospital visits I coordinated, how many emergencies I drove hours for. Then I read from the screenshot I had printed, the group chat I wasn't meant to see. Marla's words. "Delia's only useful when someone needs something. Otherwise, she just takes up space." Marla turned around finally, her face pale. "You weren't supposed to see that." I met her eyes. "But I did." The room went still. For once, nobody defended themselves quickly. There were mumbles. Mom saying she didn't recall exact numbers. Kurt muttering something about hard times. Marla whispering she didn't mean it that way. But they knew. They all knew. I placed the final page on top of the stack, closed the folder gently, and said, "I'm not here to ask for anything, not even an apology." Mom frowned. "Then why are you here?" I looked at each of them, the people I had once bent over backward to please, and said, "To give back what was never mine to carry. The responsibility, the guilt, the silence." No one moved. Kurt stared at his feet. Marla's chin trembled. Mom stayed still as a statue. "I needed you to know," I added, "that I remember. That I was there. And starting today, I'm not anymore." I tucked the folder back into my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and turned to leave. Behind me, Marla's voice came, barely above a whisper. "Delia, I didn't think you'd ever do something like this." I paused at the door, didn't turn. "I didn't either," I said, and meant it. Then I opened the door, stepped out into the cold, and the wind didn't bite. It cleared the way. The house was quiet after I finished speaking. That kind of thick, airless quiet where everyone's holding their breath, waiting for someone else to go first. I stood there, feeling the heat rise in my chest, not from anger, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding everything in for so many years. Mom was the one to break the silence. Her voice was tight, sharp around the edges. If your goal was to tear this family apart, Delia, congratulations. You're doing a damn good job. It hit me like a slap I should have seen coming. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. But the way she said it, cold, clipped, like I was a wrecking ball in her perfect little memory palace, cut straight through me. Kurt stood abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to this crap. He grabbed his coat, muttering something under his breath, something about me, always playing the victim, and stormed out, slamming the front door behind him so hard it rattled the windows. Marla finally looked up from the floor. Her eyes were glassy, voice trembling. You really are heartless. I didn't want to believe it. But you're actually proud of this, aren't you? I blinked at her. Proud? She nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. You've been sitting on all this, counting pennies like a debt collector. And now you dump it all on us, acting like you're the only one who's ever sacrificed anything. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't the money. It was the erasure. The way I'd been made to feel like my value was directly tied to how much I could give without asking for anything in return. The way I had become background noise in my own life story. I turned back to Mom. She hadn't moved, her arms still crossed like a judge waiting on a verdict. I'm not here to destroy anything, I said carefully. I'm just not going to be invisible anymore. That's all. Her jaw tensed. This is not how families work, Delia. No, I said quietly, but it's how survival works. I left before anyone else could respond. My boots echoed on the front steps, my breath fogged in the cold air, and by the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit there for a few minutes before I could even turn the key. The engine finally started, but my fingers gripped the steering wheel too tightly, like I was bracing for impact. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was loud, heavy, full of everything I hadn't said, everything I had. I started driving, half blind with the kind of tears that don't fall, just burn behind your eyes. My shoulders were tight, jaw clenched, vision blurry around the edges. Am I doing the right thing? The thought came in like a whisper, then louder. What if I really am tearing them apart? What if I could have handled it differently? Quieter? Kinder? Less honest? My chest ached with doubt, the kind that spirals when no one's around to stop it. My stomach turned with that familiar guilt, the one I'd been trained to carry since I was old enough to know what the word selfish meant. I pulled over just past the last gas station before the motel. I couldn't see the road through the tears anymore. That's when my phone rang. Nina. I didn't even say hello, just picked up and breathed into the receiver. Her voice came soft, steady. I'm still here, Delia, if you need someone to remind you that you're not crazy. I swallowed hard. I just left. Mom said I'm destroying the family. Kurt stormed out. Marla cried. And my voice cracked. I feel like I'm the bad guy. You're not, she said without hesitation. You're just the first one to stop pretending. There was a pause. I could hear a spoon clink against a mug in the background. It's normal, she continued. When you've spent your whole life being the good one, any act of self-respect feels like violence. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. It doesn't feel good. No, she said. It won't. Not yet. But you're not wrong. You're just early. That line hit me so hard I had to close my eyes. I wasn't wrong. I was just early. The first one in the room to say, this isn't working. The first one to stop covering for everyone else's messes. To stop bleeding just so the room would stay warm. I let the phone sit on my lap as Nina's words echoed in my mind. I took a few slow breaths, then looked out the windshield at the snow still falling, gentle, steady, like the world hadn't ended. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe something else had just begun. It was a Thursday afternoon, just after 4 p.m., and the light in my apartment had taken on that soft, washed-out hue that only comes when the sun dips too early and winter settles too deep. I was slicing into an overripe pear, the kind that bruises the second you touch it, wondering whether I should bother with dinner or just settle for cereal and quiet. The phone buzzed. Unknown number. Local area code. I answered without thinking. Ms. Rourke, this is Dean with Tanner and Hayes Law Group. I'm calling on behalf of your mother's estate. I stilled. My knife hovered midair. Is something wrong? I asked, though a part of me already knew. Well, he said, gently cautious, like someone breaking bad news to a stranger on a ledge. There's been a foreclosure notice issued for the property on Mulberry Lane. Your family is behind on payments. Significantly, I pressed the edge of the knife flat against the cutting board. They've asked that we reach out to you, he continued. Based on financial records, it appears you'd be eligible to co-sign or refinance the loan. You're their best chance to keep the house. Their best chance. I didn't speak right away. I just let the quiet stretch long enough for it to get uncomfortable. I appreciate you calling, I said finally, but I won't be participating. A pause. Oh, okay, he said, caught off guard. Understood. I was just asked to reach out. Of course, I replied. Good luck. I hung up and stared at my phone, still in my hand. I felt the tremor before I noticed it, my fingers twitching slightly, like my body hadn't gotten the memo that I wasn't that woman anymore. The one who would have jumped in immediately, no questions asked. The one who would have apologized for their crisis. The tremble wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was residue, old wiring sparking up one last time. It didn't take long before the second call came. This one, I recognized. My mother. Her tone was softer than usual, controlled, calculated. Delia, she said, I heard you spoke with the lawyer. I didn't respond. I know things haven't been smooth lately, she went on, but this is the house, Delia. The one your father built. The one we raised you in. Christmases, birthdays. You know how much it means. She let nostalgia do the heavy lifting. Then came the final touch, her voice dipping to a practiced hush. I know you're hurt. I do. But family is family, sweetheart. And a house is more than walls. It's our roots. I closed my eyes. She still didn't ask how I was. Still no, are you okay? Still no, I'm sorry. Just another request. Wrapped in guilt, tied with memory. I'm sorry, I said slowly. But I can't help this time. Silence. Then a quieter voice, not quite whisper, not quite accusation. You mean you won't? I didn't correct her. She was right, in her own way. About 20 minutes later, my phone lit up again. Marla. I didn't answer, but the message came through. A photo of Abby and Jonah, standing in front of the fireplace back home, smiling wide. The caption read, They miss you. I hope you don't forget them too. And for a second, my chest did ache. But it passed. Because I hadn't forgotten them. I just couldn't keep forgetting myself to remember everyone else. That night, after the sky turned black and the town quieted, I stepped out into the backyard behind my building. The air was sharp, slicing through my coat sleeves, stinging my eyes. I carried a small box under my arm, one I hadn't opened in over a year. Inside were scraps of love that once held me together, birthday cards, Mother's Day letters, crayon drawings from Abby, little notes with thanks again scribbled in rushed handwriting. Some of them still smelled faintly like the drawer I kept them in. I laid them out, one by one, in the fire pit. And then, without ceremony, I struck a match. The flame caught quickly. Edges curled. Ink bled. Names vanished. I didn't burn them out of hatred. I burned them because I needed the space back. Inside me, around me. I burned them because I'd spent too long preserving things that stopped preserving me. Because I'd carried their history like a badge, thinking it proved I was part of something, when really, it had just made it harder to walk away. As the final picture turned to ash, I whispered, not to them, not to God, not to the wind, just to myself. I don't hate you, but I'm done being the net you fall into when you refuse to stand. The fire hissed and settled, and so did I. That night, crawling into bed with the scent of smoke still in my hair. I didn't feel like a daughter who turned her back on her family. I felt like a woman who finally turned back toward herself. It's been 6 months since I packed my car and left Bozeman behind. 6 months since I let the silence speak for me for the very first time. I didn't have a grand plan when I left. Just a direction, west, toward the coast, toward something quieter. Now I live in Astoria, Oregon, a town that feels like it's perpetually caught between ocean mist and memory. Every morning, the fog drifts in like it belongs here, like it's tucking the town in gently before the world wakes up. The air smells like pine needles and damp wood, and the streets hum softly with the sounds of boats, gulls, and the occasional wind chime clinking against a weathered porch. My apartment is small, just a second-floor walk-up above a flower and bookshop tucked into a sloping street near the water. The floors creak, the kitchen window sticks when it rains, and nothing matches. But it's the first place I've ever lived where I don't feel like I'm just visiting. It's not impressive. It doesn't have to be. It's enough. I work part-time in the shop downstairs. Rosalie, the owner, is kind and chatty in a way that never feels invasive. She lets me come in early to water the plants and stay late if I want to reorganize the poetry shelf. I wrap stems in brown paper, tie ribbons around novels, brew coffee on chilly mornings. No one expects me to manage anything or solve anyone's problems. I'm not the glue here. I'm just part of the place. A quiet, steady part. And for the first time in my life, that's a role I don't resent. No one here knows the old version of me, the one who answered every late-night call, who rearranged her life to keep everyone else's intact. They don't know the weight I used to carry, or the silence I lived inside just to keep the illusion of harmony going. And I don't offer that history up. I don't need to. I've started writing again. Not for anyone else, just for me. Most days it's just fragments, sentences I whisper in my head and then scribble down. One of them stuck with me. I used to think silence was love, but really it was just the softest form of surrender. That one made my chest ache a little, because it was true, and I'd never had space to say it before. Nina still writes me every now and then, small postcards with short messages. One had a photo of a pine cone on damp earth. She'd written, "You're growing in your own direction now. That's enough." I tucked it into the notebook I carry with me to the shop. And then, not long ago, a letter came in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Marla. The envelope was thin. Inside, one sheet of paper. No greeting, no explanation. Just one sentence written in blue ink. "I'm sorry. You don't owe me anything. You never did." I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant or bitter. Just still. It was the kind of apology that comes too late to fix anything, but not too late to matter. I folded the letter gently and placed it in the drawer next to my bed, right beside a key I no longer carry and a pressed birthday card from Nina with wildflowers tucked inside. That night, I made pasta with garlic and olive oil. Simple, no occasion. I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle I bought on sale, and let an old jazz record play on my thrift store turntable. I didn't think about who I used to be. I didn't think about who I used to carry. I just was. And that was enough. The next morning, I walked the trail along the beach, like I always do on my days off. The sea was half hidden behind the mist, the waves slow and steady. My hair was unbrushed, my coat too thin for the wind, but I didn't care. A little girl ran past me, red jacket flapping behind her like a flag. She looked back and smiled with her whole face. "Hi!" she shouted. "Hi there," I said, smiling back. She didn't know me. She didn't know what I used to be, what I used to carry. And she didn't need to. No one here does. They don't know I once measured my worth in favors, in silence, in the ability to never make anyone uncomfortable. They don't know I used to call that love. Now I belong to no one but myself. I pour my own coffee. I open the mail slowly. I write in margins and forget to return texts. I answer only when I want to. I'm not the good daughter anymore. I'm not the peacekeeper. I'm not the silent strength behind the chaos. I'm just Delia. And I don't owe anyone an explanation for that. It's not perfect, but it's mine. And it's finally enough. Before we end, I just want to say this. I know I'm not the only one who's ever had to unlearn the idea that love means self-sacrifice. Maybe you've been the strong one too. The reliable one. The quiet one. If you have, I hope you know this. You're allowed to change. You're allowed to choose yourself. Have you ever felt that quiet shift, the moment you stop being who they expect and start becoming who you really are? If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one. I've got more to tell. Maybe, just maybe, you'll see a little of yourself there too.